And now I'd like to invite the panelists to join me on stage.
Please welcome cancer researcher, Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, Jack Andraka. Chairman and CEO, Life Technologies, Gregory Lucier. Finance Minister, Federal Republic of Nigeria, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. President, the Ford Foundation, Luis A. Obonbinyas. And President, Mosaic, Billy Parrish.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for joining us this morning for the case for optimism in the 21st century. I think it is impossible to be cynical here at CGI. And admittedly, as some of us were talking about earlier backstage, given all the research that shows there's likely such a thing as the optimist gene, it's probably impossible for me to be cynical in my family. If you heard either of my parents yesterday, or particularly my father last night. And as our last series of commitment makers were focused on youth empowerment, I think it makes sense to start with Jack, who was born the same year that I graduated from high school and is probably the youngest person in this room. And to ensure that I give him the introduction he's due, I actually need to look at my notes. Jack's cancer testing method that he's developed has been found to be 168 times faster, 26,000 times cheaper, and 400 times more sensitive than the current gold standard cancer testing methodologies that we use here in the United States today. His mentor at the lab where he works in Johns Hopkins has referred to him as our next Edison. At the recent 2012 Intel Science Fair, Jack was awarded more than $100,000 in grants, and he is still in high school. One of the things that I find most inspiring, and one of the reasons I find Jack's story such a source of optimism, is his belief that not only his story is unique and remarkable, but that his story is quite possible anywhere in the world. And so, Jack, I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you came to do your work and why you believe that any kid anywhere in the world could also help change all of our futures.
Well, first, thank you for inviting me here, but I actually became interested in pancreatic cancer because a close family friend had passed due to the disease, and also it's really impacted my family. And from there, I got really interested in early detection, and what I found is that 85% of pancreatic cancers are diagnosed late, when a patient has less than a 2% chance of survival. And so then what I did is I started on this really long journey of using Google really, only to find all of this information. And what I found is that there is this information on carbon nanotubes and thick tubes of carbon, and they're really the superheroes of material science. They have these incredible properties. And then I was actually in high school biology class. I knew about this one cancer biomarker, and it's found in your blood for pancreatic, ovarian, and lung cancer.
And Jack, what grade were you in when?
I was actually in 8th grade when I came up with the idea. And so I was in my biology class, and we were learning about antibodies, the usual biology thing. And what these are, there's these lock and key molecules. They attach only to a specific protein. And I was thinking maybe that could provide the selectivity of the test towards these 3 cancers, while the carbon nanotubes provide the sensitivity. And from there, I just came up with this idea by connecting the dots, and I started on this research path And after 7 months, I came up with this thing that costs only 3 cents and takes 5 minutes to run and can diagnose cancer nearly instantaneously, basically like a diabetes test strip. And what I think we're going to be seeing is this real paradigm shift in how research is done. Because thanks to Google and like Wikipedia, we now have this, yes, Wikipedia is how I got through middle school at sometimes. What I think we're going to be seeing is this paradigm shift from a lot of older researchers doing the work to younger researchers, because now you don't have to go through a college education in order to be like an expert in your field. You can find all of that information through research articles on Google and Wikipedia.
This is music to Peter Thiel's ears, if he's listening. And, Jack, you had to have a lot of persistence, too. And yes. I think that's also an important dimension of optimism, is knowing that although maybe you won't break through initially, that you believe in your work so fundamentally, and that each step is informed by each misstep before it. Could you talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, so actually in order to get into the lab, so I had this brilliant idea, but you can't do that at your house. Like, I don't have that stuff. And no, I secretly have a cancer research in my basement. And so what actually happened is I sent out, I kind of felt like an online stalker here. I went to like all of these web pages and was like copying and pasting email addresses. And I sent out 200 of these emails to...
How many responses did you get?
I got 200, 199 of them being negative, saying, no, you're too young, this isn't going to work. Even my parents were actually saying this isn't going to work. But I actually thought that was kind of a reasonable idea. It was like logical. And so I just kept that, and eventually I finally got one acceptance in the lab at Erebon Maitra. But what you have to realize is that everyone has that persistence, really. I was just a normal kid. Nobody knew me. I just sent out a lot of letters and eventually got one acceptance. So if you persist, like, you'll have that optimism and you'll be able to like do great things, is what I really think.
Well, yes. Jack, I don't think anyone in this room would see you as a normal kid. But we certainly hope everyone has your persistence and grit. Greg, you've talked about how the life sciences really will transform the 21st century. And your company has developed a machine that can sequence someone's entire genome in a day for about $1,000. How do you think that development will not only change life here in the United States, but could also change life in Madam Minister's country of Nigeria and around the world? And why are you so optimistic?
Well, Chelsea, thank you very much for allowing me to be here. It's a real privilege, but I have to say, after listening to Jack now, it's a real advantage because I found the person I'm going to hire when I leave this panel.
But I bet a lot of people in the room feel that way, Greg, so you better snag him first.
We could use more Jacks. I'm incredibly optimistic when I look forward, and maybe I'll speak about that in a moment, but first to put that in context is to look backwards. And I think if you look into the 20th century, it was really shaped by the development of the physical sciences and ultimately manifesting itself with the ability of semiconductors and electronics to transform first, certainly computerization and applications, but then second, communication and how humans interact with each other. And as I'm sure we'll hear from some of our other panelists, even now more recently, how we even think about societies and we govern ourselves. So technology drove the way society ultimately developed. And I think now as we go into the 21st century, here at just the very beginning, I think life sciences now will transform societies in ways that we can't even imagine just yet. And it will be driven by this technology to ultimately characterize the living system and then do it and harness it for good. And it all starts with reading the human genome incredibly accurately, fast, inexpensively, that then leads you to so many positive things just in the near-term horizon. You now can read in the newspapers anywhere in the world about how cancer is being transformed from a death sentence to something that's more akin to a chronic disease. And that's certainly within our grasp, in our horizon. This technology to characterize the living system quickly, accurately, inexpensively will also transform nations in terms of their ability to understand which crops will exist in their terrain and their locale and really provide great nutrition for their people. And so I think we're just at the very beginning of even conceiving what life sciences will do to our world, to our society, even beyond what I've just described, which is within our grasp in the next 5-7 years. If you go out 20 years, you can only get even more optimistic about how this ability to, for example, re-engineer algae to make gasoline, that is certainly within our grasp in the next decade or so. And I think you just can go on and on about the opportunity to transform societies, our standard of living, and hopefully make the world a better place.
Great. Billy, I saw you nodding vigorously while Greg was talking. And at Mosaic, you're trying to ensure that more people can participate in not only availing themselves of current technologies, particularly in solar, but also helping push forward the boundaries of what renewable energy and technology more broadly can do for us. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what you've done at Mosaic and why you're so optimistic?
Yeah. So Mosaic is an online marketplace where anyone can invest directly in clean energy and other energy infrastructure. And we were started really because we saw two major constraints to the growth of clean energy. And one is finance. Right now there's $70 billion a year going into solar finance. We need $400 billion a year by the end of the decade going into solar finance. So we need massive new amounts of capital.
And you say we need that because of what? Or to achieve what?
To achieve the kind of carbon reductions that are needed to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. And so Mosaic is bringing a major new source of capital into financing clean energy. And we think that also helps with the second biggest constraint that the clean energy industry is facing, which is the lack of a stable policy environment. You know, my friends in the industry talk about the solar industry as a solar coaster, because we get policies, we get incentives, and then they get taken away. And, you know, our goal is to get millions of people tangibly invested in the clean energy future that we all want to see, so that we have the base of political support to have long-term stable policy environment to grow this incredibly important industry for our country and for the planet.
And what are you seeing in terms of who's participating in Mosaic that's helping make you so optimistic?
So I think it relates to kind of two of the biggest themes that I think we'll see on this panel, which are, you know, I actually had at the end of 2009, I was less optimistic than I am now. I had a one-year-old daughter. I had spent most of the year working on passing federal climate legislation in the U.S. I had spent a lot of the year preparing for the international climate negotiations in Copenhagen. Neither of those things went very well that year. And, you know, I've been watching the trend of carbon emissions going up and up and up. Almost every major indicator, key progress indicator for our society has been going in the right direction, except for carbon. Carbon keeps going up. We just can't bend that curve. But I think two of the themes that make me the most hopeful about where we're going are what Jack was talking about, you know, the pace of new technology, and we're seeing that in clean energy. We're seeing thin film solar technologies that are a quarter the cost of the lowest cost solar on the market. It's following Moore's law. It's a semiconductor technology. We're seeing negative carbon technologies coming out that can actually suck carbon out of the sky. So we're seeing this technological innovation that is only accelerating. And then we're seeing the power of the internet to tap the vast human potential to solve these great problems. You know, I look at platforms like Kiva, which have channeled $300 million into microfinance. Kickstarter put more money into the arts than the National Endowment of the Arts last year. Lending Club and Prosper, our peer-to-peer peer-to-peer consumer lending platforms, are going to put $1 billion into consumer lending this year. Innocentive is open source innovation platform where you can put out problems and have them solved by hundreds of thousands of solvers in their network. And these two forces of being able to just put out big ideas and harness collaboration and to accelerate the deployment of new disruptive technologies is where I get a lot of my hope from.
I think that's a perfect segue to you, Luis. We were talking earlier that optimism is a mix of pragmatism focused on real solutions, like what we spend a lot of time here at CGI discussing, and also big dreams and radical ideas. And I know you have a couple of radical ideas that are really fueling how the Ford Foundation thinks about its work in the world. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about those, and hopefully with as much enthusiasm and optimism as you did earlier.
Yeah, thank you, Chelsea. It's intimidating to be on a panel with someone in high school who's this articulate, but we can try. Our basic belief is that progress is people, and that as the world becomes more inclusive in a series of different ways I'll describe, that this magic thing will happen. And we know it happens because we saw it in athletic records. It used to be that athletic records used to fall in this kind of non-Moore's law kind of way, in this linear way, as people got better nutrition and better training. Then something really strange started happening. The records started falling exponentially to places people thought were physically impossible. Why? It wasn't better training, they checked. It wasn't better nutrition, they checked. It was inclusion. All of a sudden, people from Kenya were running. All of a sudden, people from Austria were lifting. On and on and on. And by including more people, magic started to happen. So, what's the world right now? Well, the world is growing more and more inclusive every day. More women entering the mainstream. That's half the population. Remember, 100 years ago, we didn't have them. More poor people and indigenous people being allowed to lead countries and participate. More inclusive. Democracy has never been more prevalent. Boy, it's really worrisome out there. Lots is going on, but let's remember that we've never had a more democratic world than we have right now. South America, where I just got back from, is a perfect example. Brazil, Chile, Argentina, all democracies. Wasn't the case in 1976. And then there's this technological change that's taking all of these people and making their interaction more and more frictionless. So that out there, just like with the runners in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, is a Jack who happens to live in southern Kenya. And he can now communicate. He can actually access that same internet. He may even be doing it on newfangled technology that allows him to do it on a 2G phone. But the magic of having that girl or that boy who's 12 or that man or that woman who's 22 or 32 included in the capacity for the world to achieve progress has never been matched. And I know that out of that will come these amazing people I'm sitting here with in the billions.
And how is that influencing what the Ford Foundation is funding and nurturing?
I see it all the time. I was in southern Kenya, and this woman who didn't even have a cell phone had a little chip that cost almost nothing that she put into borrowed cell phones. She's now connected to the world. So we're changing in Kenya, working with them, to change how benefits are delivered to her. And the dollars that used to go on a truck and maybe get to her or maybe not, get to her phone exactly when they should and exactly the amount they should. I was in Brazil just last week in a small, tiny village, 28 people, who'd used satellite technology, a grantee of ours, to map their territory. They then used those maps to say, this is our land. We've always had this land. We don't have title, but we're going to get title. And you have to create a process for us to get title. By the way, they got title. And now they're preserving that land, keeping the carbon, the deforestation and carbon problem that results from it from not being there, better than the preserved land next door that was set aside as a preserve, because they live there, they own it, they want it to be that way 50 years from now. You can see every day, whether it's a program to change how benefits are delivered, or program to map the forest, how including people, giving them power, bringing them into the mainstream, changes the trajectory of what's happening locally and globally.
And Madam Minister, a woman who certainly is included, the Minister of Finance in Nigeria, and someone who was a leading contender to be the president of the World Bank. You are deeply optimistic not only about Nigeria, which has a growth rate, the envy of the developed world, but also about Africa regionally and the ways in which Africa is investing now in itself and supporting its own continued growth. Could you talk about both why you're so optimistic about Nigeria and why you're so optimistic about Africa?
Well, thank you very much, Chelsea. After listening to my panelists, actually, I feel we should all just leave the stage and listen to Jack. I'm quite, especially since I'm a cancer survivor. I mean, what he has just done is amazing. But I feel even more optimistic after listening to my panelists. And I just want to talk a little bit about Africa, Nigeria. You know, every time we know that the world is very uncertain and volatile right now. We often hear the statistics, 1 billion people living under $1.25 a day, almost 1 billion people going hungry, hundreds of millions dying of disease. And I think when we hear all of that, the first image that comes to mind is Africa, isn't it? Conflict, disease. And that's the Africa we think about. So today, because I'm an eternal optimist about Africa, I have to confess that, I wanted to share with you another Africa and the reason why we should be optimistic. Because if it can happen on that continent, it can happen anywhere else in the world. 2 decades ago, the continent was written off as a lost continent. I think many of you have read those articles. Growth was about 2% through the 80s and 90s. Lower than the population growth rate, which meant that per capita income was actually falling and not increasing. Poverty was rising. And all that was going on throughout those decades. The governments were doing a lot of reform. And it was a very tough time. And then fast forward to now. I don't think many people actually realize what's going on the continent. For the past decade, Africa has been growing at better than 5% steadily, and things have turned around. And all the indicators that were going in the right direction are moving that were going in the wrong direction are moving now in the right direction. Am I saying that there are no problems? No, we still have problems of disease and governance and so on. But it is a radical change. As Chelsea said, my country is growing at about 6.5%, projected to grow at 6.8%, has been growing at 7% for the past 8 years or so. The continent itself has been growing, and it's changing things. It's driving down poverty, maybe not at as fast a rate as we would want, but that's going down. How is this happening? How is it happening? It's happening because people have taken the tough decisions, and policymakers have put together policies that are really much more encouraging to private sector investment than had been the case before. Some of the barriers to investment are being put down. Policymakers are no longer talking about aid, they're talking about investment. And many people do not know that the average rate of return on investment in that continent is above 30%. So there's another Africa out there that is behaving differently. And it's the Africa that is giving me a lot of optimism. Now, let me just tell you 3 stories, and I want to take a poll here. I don't know if I can see people. How many of you have ever heard of Ushahidi? Good, a few people have. How many have heard of e-pedigree? Okay. How many have heard of M-Pesa? Okay. I want to say a quick thing about those 3 because of the discoveries by Jack. Now, Ushahidi means testimony in Swahili. And this is a website founded by young Kenyans who came together in the post-Kenya election violence to use citizen reporters to track and map areas of conflict where conflict was occurring. This methodology and approach was used in post-earthquake Haiti to map in places of incidences of where people were having difficulty. It's been extended to other areas, but very few people know that it's young Africans who founded this and who developed this. E-pedigree is a system for tracing fake drugs. 30 to 40% of the drugs on the continent are fake, and hundreds of millions of lives are lost by people taking the wrong medication. A young Ghanaian developed a very simple system whereby people can scratch off and text a number on a batch to a place, and it can be verified as to whether this is a genuine batch or not. And this is saving lives on the continent. M-Pesa, many more of you have heard of mobile money. Now look at what is happening that is giving me a lot of hope on the continent. Take my country, for example. In 2000, we had 450,000 landlines for a population of over 100 million. Today, we have 100 million mobile lines for a population of 170 million people. So this is a whole new revolution, and over 400 million lines on the continent and growing. This means that the mobile payment systems are causing a revolution, not only in Kenya, but all over. Just this morning, my colleague, Minister Adeshina, talked about how we're using mobile phones to text money to farmers, so that they can go and buy fertilizer and avoid corrupt middlemen who are taking away the fertilizer. We've gone from 11% of farmers receiving fertilizer to 90% of them receiving fertilizer. So all these developments being done by young Africans, well, not quite as young as Jack, but I hope we'll be approaching. It gives a sense of optimism that this continent that people constantly think of as rife with problems has turned the corner. Not even is turning, has turned the corner. And only the smart people will get their foot in the door now to invest. So if you think you're smart, this is the time to come to Africa. And by the way, if you're not in Nigeria, you're not in Africa.
Yeah. Greg, I saw you nodding while the minister was speaking. How do you see the intersection of mobile technology with the life sciences? What's really the potency of what's happening around genomics and the research that you're seeing to be taken up around the world, and how can mobile play a part in that?
Well, I think it's the combination of what the Madam Minister said and what Jack did. I mean, Jack is doing some amazing research, and he was inspired by what he learned on the internet. And so I think this ability now to move ever faster in our accumulation of knowledge for advancement is taking place. And so in the world of genomics, where we're really just finally now getting going, I mean, my company was the prime contractor on the Human Genome Project in your father's administration, and that was several $billion just a decade ago, and now we've got it down to $1,000. We've learned more just in the last 2 to 3 years of how life works than we have in the last 25. And so we're just at this inflection point now where the miniaturization, the economization can link up with mobile phones, the internet, and we're going to see an explosion of development, all for the positive.
And clearly there's a democratization of discovery,
Exactly
as we
right.
were hearing from Jack initially. And Jack, when you kind of think about how you did your own research and how nimbly you were able to do it using Google and then working in the lab, juxtaposed to now the possibly 10 years that it will take for you to move your research from existing in the lab to being commercially viable and out in the market, what does that do to your optimism?
Well, we can only get better. So, for example,
A perfectly optimistic response.
For example, it's kind of ridiculous that we have all these different approval systems where, for example, say I seek approval in Britain, then it's going to be, I have to restart in Nigeria. It's kind of ridiculous how we have this really, ineffective FDA approval system. And,
So if there are any regulators in the room.
I was talking to this one person, and there's now this trend in health companies where they want to look at staples such as toothpaste because that's a steady source of income. With pills and treatments, that's not a steady source because it takes like 20 years to get on the market, and then your patent's over and you don't make any money. So what we really have to have is this like global, like universal like approval system where you can get approval really, really quickly and not have to go through the same tests like 50 times.
And do you think that different countries should do a better job of learning from one another?
Um,
And things like that?
yeah, like for example, like the US, for example, could learn a lot from other countries, but also some countries that don't have as good of an approval system that's unsafe for their citizens should also learn from ones that have safer. So it's kind of like a balance between safe and getting the treatment to people as fast as possible. So it's going to be really interesting in the next few years if we have those types of reforms.
Madam Minister, I see you nodding. And one of the things I know you focused on in Nigeria is governance reform. Both focusing on increasing transparency and the importance of transparency, but also increasing efficiency. And could you talk about why government and governance is also a source of optimism for you in Nigeria and around Africa?
Well, thank you. I was just also nodding because I thought maybe we should invite Jack to get approvals in Nigeria. And maybe our NAFDAC. Actually, we have a pretty good Food and Drug Administration, but also maybe work faster and get it approved. Yes, most people really do not think of government and governance, generally the world over, as a source of optimism. If you look at worldwide polls on governments and people, you'll find that the level of trust has gone down in most countries. People do not trust their governments. They don't trust their leaders. There's this disconnect in country after country, including my own. There's a lack of trust. But I think the reason I'm optimistic is because civil society is on the rise. And civil society is putting a lot of pressure and demanding accountability, more transparency, open governance systems. And I don't think this will go away. And the availability of systems of communication that we're all talking about, including social media, which, by the way, is not always used to the good. I'll come back to that. But, that's providing a means of keeping governments on their toes and keeping them open. I've found, as somebody who is a policymaker and this is my second time around as a minister, that the more transparent you are, the more information you share with people. When we publish every month the revenues that government gets. At the federal government level, because we're a federal system, state and local government. This is like a revolution. Because people can now hold their policymakers accountable. Before governors and local government people and ministers used to say, well, we didn't get enough money. Now when they're published, they can say, well, you got $1 million in this local government. Why are teachers not being paid? Why is there no chalk in the classrooms? And so the more transparent you are, the better. The more trust you can create. And civil society will keep us on our toes. That's my source of optimism. Of course, when you're on the firing line, you don't always feel as optimistic when they're doing it. But if you abstract yourself and you know that on the continent, we're getting stronger and stronger civil society groups, that helps. Finally, the one point I'd like to make is that, civil society also needs to be more accountable itself. And this is an issue, I think, that will continue to rise as we go forward. But it won't take away from my optimism that the pressure will be on government to be more open, more accountable, do away with corruption, and keep a system in which can breed more trust by people.
Louise, from the Ford Foundation's perspective, and also from your personal perspective, what do you think about what the Madam Minister just said in terms of increasing transparency and also mutual accountability between civil society, governments, and also the private sector as a source of not only kind of momentum, but also real optimism?
I think you make the key point, which is it is the interweaving of these sectors that drives change. It is civil society experimenting, civil society trying new things, civil society doing everything from the research to the beta testing. But doing that wherever possible in concert with 80% of the economy that's private, with the vast capacity of government to mobilize and implement, and to serve that key thing that civil society really can do, which is to take risk, to invest in change. All the time, I tell folks that we need to bring to ourselves a little bit of that entrepreneurial spirit, a little bit of that investor perspective that creates companies like life science companies. It says, out there's some innovation that's going to solve the problem of ballot boxes disappearing. Well, you know what that is? RF chips. Out there's some little innovation that's going to keep violence from spreading from polling place to polling place. Well, you know what that is? Wireless streaming of polling place video from disparate locations to a centralized location, linked to being able to call in whatever resources you need to keep the violence from spreading. We have the capacity, if we really can interweave civil society and government with private sector innovation, to do things that we couldn't even imagine. And what could be more optimistic than that?
And the theme of CGI this year is designing for impact. And so how do you think about designing those pilot programs that civil society would be willing to take the risk to do initially, such that they then could be translated into the public sector and scaled in the ways in which really only government can ultimately do?
So this is a process we've gone through at Ford very, very intensely. And by the way, not easily. It's not easy for any organization to ask ourselves, what is the end goal first? Now let's build a strategy for achieving that end goal. Let's build an ecosystem of partners, because we certainly can't do anything alone. No one can. Let's figure out what it's really going to take to achieve that end goal. Not the process of achieving it. That comes second. But what is it we're trying to achieve, and who do we need to work with in order to achieve it? And it's that beginning with the vision of what you want to accomplish that makes everything else so much easier. And it is, I think, the central thing when I speak to grantees, when I speak to other people in philanthropy, when I speak to public and private sector people. I always begin the conversation with, tell me what we're trying to do together. What does winning look like? And then let's work back from there.
Makes a lot of sense. Since this is happening in the 21st century and about the 21st century, I didn't think we could have a panel without soliciting and taking questions from Twitter and Facebook. And I have a question for Billy from Jesse Contreras. Can a true fight against global warming and modern consumerism exist together?
That's a great question. And a tough question. We look at a world that is approaching 7 billion people and will soon be 8 and then 9. And, with our current technology set, with the way we make all of the things that we consume and then dispose of all of those things, it's not possible. With the technologies that are coming online, with closed-loop manufacturing processes, with manufacturing and transportation systems that are powered by clean energy, I believe we can have prosperity across the planet, even at these large and growing population sizes. So, I want to ask if anybody else is as inspired by this panel as I am. I'm just kind of feeling overwhelmed by it a little bit, and feel like this is the future unfolding, and things I didn't think were possible years ago, I'm now seeing happen right now. So there's actually an existence proof of a world that looks very different and much more beautiful and sustainable and prosperous than the one we have now.
And Madam Minister, what do you think about that question? How do you, in Nigeria, think about continuing to sort of unleash the human potential without unleashing, commensurate amounts of carbon into the air, or harvesting in an irresponsible way your abundant natural resources?
I think that's a very tough question, and that we have quite a long way, from having the answers or being able to do it the way we should. I have to say that, as you know, we're an oil-based economy. We've got lots of practices that are still harmful to the environment, lots of environmental degradation in the Niger Delta, and we're just coming to grips with that. We have gas flaring, which has been going on, which is harmful, which we have now set deadlines, for oil companies to phase out gas flaring completely. We have, like many countries, energy subsidies, which do not help, and I think everybody saw live our attempt to phase out those subsidies and how politically painful that was, and how there was a pushback from the population because they do not accept that, subsidizing petroleum because they feel this is the biggest benefit they get really harms the environment. So we have all those problems, and one has to be very upfront. But the good thing is we recognize where the challenges are. And so one by one, we are trying to tackle them, like setting dates for removing gas flaring, like trying to weave into, we now have a terrific agricultural plan, that is going to enable us to farm in a much more sustainable and environmentally conscious way. And we're trying to weave that at the same time into changing the way that we manage agriculture. So it's changing the way we think about things. Solid waste problems, how do we solve those in a manner that is carbon friendly and friendly to the environment? So I think the beginning of wisdom is recognizing the problems you have. For a long time, we didn't really think about them in that way. And it's now that we're one by one putting them on the table and saying, what are the solutions? And because technology is evolving and changing so fast in the world, we don't have to reinvent anything, but to adapt the systems to what we have within our country. I saw a solid waste management system in Turkey that was being used that is just fabulous, that is totally recycling waste and using the heat to grow tomatoes and selling that in Ankara. And, it's like a total system. And we're looking at things like that. How do we bring that in so that we can behave in a much more environmentally friendly manner?
And learning from what works. I mean, you talked about Ushahidi earlier and how then that technology became Person Finder in Haiti and then became Harass Map in Tahrir Square. In our last couple of minutes, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to briefly talk about what do you think our education system needs to look like to ensure that all of this optimism becomes our reality and then helps find and encourage the next Jacks. And I think I'll give Jack the last word as he also had the first. So Billy, could we start with you and then just move down the line?
Yeah, 2 quick plugs. I think every school in the world should be powered by solar energy. And I think young people can be involved in making that happen, and it can be incorporated into the curriculum. And also working in the energy and finance sectors. 2 of the most male and white sectors here in the U.S. It's pretty painful, actually. I think we need entrepreneurship training to change the mix, because we need some new ideas and some new thinking and new perspectives in 2 of those biggest and most broken industries on the planet.
Great. Luis?
If I had one single thing to do, I would have schools look much more inclusive of girls. If we don't have girls in schools, we're leaving half the potential for progress on the table. We're not even playing the game. And in country after country, girls are sent into marriage, kept at home, kept out of school, kept second. School fees bar them. If we don't have every girl who can be in school, we're leaving it on the table. We're not even playing.
Madam Minister?
Thank you. I want to strongly support Luis on the girls. But, for me, I think education, I would like to see a much more disruptive education system and more accessible. I want to tear the present approaches down because I don't really think they're working in many countries, including mine. I want this idea of handing these laptops solar-driven to kids and leaving them much more open, democratize education a bit more, and let kids get their hands on it. The second thing I would like is skills. I think the education system is really not providing skills for this tomorrow. And that's one place where, that optimism, we really have to push in many of the developing countries, including mine.
Also in the developed countries.
For a skills-based, which means we need to think of what my two neighbors here to the right are doing and say, what type of education system, what type of skills, what type of mindset, analytical framework do you need to be able to do these? So that's what and how do we pay for some of these things? It's easy for me to sit here and say, laptops with solar for every child, but I'm a finance minister. So when they come and say we need to provide laptops for every child, and I'm looking at the bill and trying to compare it with what we need to spend for the roads and the school, So how, do we go for this for the financial transactions tax, for instance, that is being put globally? Do we all adopt that to generate some more money in order to pay for some of these things? These are the thoughts that I struggle with.
Greg?
I think schools need to move faster. We've got to break down the walls. We've got to bring in the worldwide voices and experts to these children, because things are moving so much faster than textbooks now. And so just in the field of sciences, more external people coming into the lives of these children earlier could be a game changer.
And Jack?
Well, I believe that we should definitely add more technology into schools, and that the teachers should act more as a moderator, like teaching the kids how to think and like how to innovate, because we have access to this like thousands of bits of information and like millions, but why memorize something that you can just look up and in 3 seconds know? You should know how to use that information, not how to like know that information. It's regurgitation that's like kind of killing us.
Well, I certainly am more optimistic. And I think that Jack needs to ensure that he's not marauded afterwards by people who want to hire him. And certainly, Madam Minister, I hope that everyone heard your message loudly and clearly about both Nigeria and Africa. And I hope that those in the NGO and philanthropic community heard your message, Luis, about actually listening to what people need and want and how best to help them achieve their dreams. And Greg, I hope all of us understand that we have not yet even begun to imagine what the life sciences can and will do for us. And Billy, I think what you're doing around mosaic and solar energy hopefully will prove to be a paradigm so that all of us can better participate and collaborate in our energy futures. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you for giving us so many reasons to be optimistic, and thank you for giving us so much work to do. Thank you all.